I never thought my life would unravel at 52. I had spent 28 years climbing the corporate ladder at Henderson Financial Group, working late nights, sacrificing weekends, and missing countless family dinners to prove my worth. I was Jennifer Hayes, Senior Vice President of Operations, a title I wore like armor against the world's judgments about middle-aged women in finance. My corner office overlooked downtown Manhattan, and my salary afforded me a comfortable apartment in Brooklyn, a reliable German sedan, and the occasional vacation to places I was too busy to truly enjoy. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I woke at 5:30, went through my morning routine with mechanical precision, and arrived at the office by 7:15. My assistant Marcus greeted me with his usual cheerful smile and a steaming cup of black coffee. The quarterly earnings report was due in 2 days, and I had been working 16-hour days to ensure every number was perfect, every projection defensible. At 10:43, my phone buzzed. It was David Chen, the new chief executive officer who had joined the company 6 months earlier. He was 41, ambitious, and eager to prove himself to the board. We had clashed several times over his aggressive expansion plans, which I believed were reckless and potentially harmful to our long-term stability. I had voiced my concerns directly, perhaps too directly, in several executive meetings. The message was brief. He wanted to see me in his office immediately. I grabbed my tablet with the latest financial projections and walked down the hallway, my heels clicking against the marble floor with the confidence of someone who had navigated corporate politics for nearly 3 decades. David's office was twice the size of mine, recently renovated with glass walls and minimalist furniture that screamed expensive consultant. He didn't invite me to sit. That should have been my first warning. David spoke without preamble. "We're restructuring the operations department. Your position is being eliminated effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Your severance package will be emailed within the hour." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what I had just heard. I managed to stammer out a question about why, about my performance reviews, about the projects I was leading. David's expression remained neutral, almost bored. He mentioned something about new strategic directions and bringing in fresh perspectives. The subtext was clear. I was too old, too expensive, and too willing to challenge his authority. I wanted to argue, to fight back, to demand an explanation that made sense. Instead, I felt something inside me crack. 28 years of loyalty, of dedication, of sacrificing my personal life for this company, and I was being discarded like outdated equipment. The humiliation burned through my chest as a security guard appeared at the door. The walk back to my office was the longest of my life. Colleagues averted their eyes as I passed, word already spreading through the office grapevine. Marcus looked horrified when I told him what happened. He helped me pack my belongings into a cardboard box while the security guard watched from the doorway. Family photos, a few awards I had been proud of once, a potted plant that had survived longer than some of my relationships. My entire professional life fit into 2 boxes. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I did something I would regret for weeks to come. I saw Christine Park, the chief financial officer and someone I had considered a friend, standing near the elevator. She had remained silent during the executive meetings when David criticized my approach. She had not defended me, had not returned my calls the previous evening when I sensed something was wrong. The hurt and betrayal boiled over. I confronted her right there in the lobby, my voice rising as I accused her of cowardice, of complicity in what I called a political purge. I said things I should not have said, made accusations I could not prove, and burned a bridge that had taken years to build. Christine's face turned red, then white. She told me I was being unprofessional and paranoid, that I was embarrassing myself. Security escorted me out as other employees watched the spectacle. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, shaking with rage and humiliation. Then I drove home through midday traffic, my mind spiraling through disbelief, anger, and growing panic. I was 52 years old with a mortgage, substantial monthly expenses, and a professional reputation I had just torched in spectacular fashion. The following days blurred together in a haze of shock and denial. I updated my resume, reached out to my network, and applied to dozens of positions. The responses were polite but firm. I was overqualified for some roles, too expensive for others. Several recruiters hinted that my very public confrontation with Christine had made me untouchable. Word traveled fast in Manhattan financial circles. My savings account dwindled with alarming speed. The severance package was less generous than I expected, carefully calculated to avoid any legal obligations. After 4 months, I had burned through most of my emergency fund. The rent was due, utility bills piled up, and my car payment loomed like a threat. I stopped going to my favorite coffee shop, canceled my gym membership, and learned to grocery shop at discount stores. Pride kept me from telling my family how bad things had gotten. My younger sister Rachel lived in Connecticut with her husband and 3 kids. She had always been the creative one, teaching art at a local high school while I pursued corporate success. Our relationship was cordial but distant, shaped by decades of unspoken competition and different life choices. I could not bear to admit that her steady, modest life might have been wiser than my ambitious climb. By month 7, desperation replaced denial. I needed income, any income, immediately. The high-level executive positions I qualified for were not materializing, and I could no longer afford to wait. I swallowed what remained of my pride and applied for retail positions, administrative assistant roles, and anything else that might pay the bills. That is how I found myself at age 52, with 3 degrees and decades of executive experience, interviewing for a delivery driver position at Tony's Pizza Palace, a local chain with 12 locations across Brooklyn and Queens. The manager, a 29-year-old named Derek who looked young enough to be my son, seemed uncomfortable interviewing someone his mother's age. He asked if I could handle the physical demands of the job, if I was comfortable working nights and weekends, if I had reliable transportation. I assured him I could do everything required and more. I needed this job desperately, and the desperation must have shown in my voice. Derek hired me on the spot, probably because most people did not want to deliver pizza in New York traffic for minimum wage plus tips. My first shift was humbling in ways I had not anticipated. The uniform was a red polo shirt with the Tony's Pizza Palace logo and a matching baseball cap. I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror before my shift, barely recognizing the woman looking back. Gone was the power suit and designer jewelry. In their place was polyester and the smell of garlic bread. The other drivers were mostly college students and recent immigrants working multiple jobs to survive. They were kind enough, but I could sense their confusion about why someone my age was doing this work. I kept my history vague, mentioning only that I was between opportunities. The truth was too painful, too embarrassing to share with strangers. Delivering pizza in New York City tested every ounce of patience I had left. Traffic was nightmarish, parking was impossible, and apartment buildings were often confusing mazes of identical hallways. I hauled insulated bags up 5-floor walk-ups, navigated aggressive drivers, and smiled politely when customers complained about delivery times I could not control. My feet ached, my back protested, and my ego suffered 1,000 small cuts every time someone addressed me with the casual dismissiveness reserved for service workers. The tips were unpredictable. Some people were generous, pressing an extra $10 or $20 into my hand with genuine kindness. Others counted out exact change down to the penny, their eyes sliding past me as though I were invisible. I learned quickly which neighborhoods tipped well, and which saw delivery drivers as inconveniences rather than people. During those first weeks, I experienced moments of crushing despair that took me completely by surprise. I would be sitting in my car between deliveries, eating a granola bar because I could not afford lunch, and suddenly tears would stream down my face. The contrast between who I had been and who I had become felt unbearable. I had managed billion-dollar budgets, and now I was grateful for a $5 tip. I had led teams of talented professionals, and now I took orders from someone young enough to be my child. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part. I could not tell anyone what I was going through. My former colleagues had moved on, many of them probably relieved they were not the ones carrying boxes out of the building. My professional network had evaporated the moment word spread about my confrontation with Christine. Even casual acquaintances seemed to vanish, as though failure might be contagious. I started avoiding places where I might run into people from my old life. I changed my grocery store, my dry cleaner, even my pharmacy. Manhattan suddenly felt like a minefield of potential humiliation. Every trip out in my pizza delivery uniform carried the risk of encountering someone who had known me as Senior Vice President Hayes, confident and successful and in control. One evening, about 6 weeks into the job, I delivered to a residential building in the Upper West Side. The customer was a woman in her mid-30s who worked from home, based on the home office I glimpsed through her open door. She was kind, tipped well, and made small talk about the weather. As I turned to leave, she said something that stopped me cold. She told me she admired people who did honest work like delivering food. Her father had been a delivery driver for 30 years, she said, and it had put her through college. She said there was dignity in any work done well, and she thanked me for bringing dinner to her family. I barely made it to my car before breaking down. This stranger's simple kindness, her recognition of my humanity, cracked something open inside me. For the first time since the firing, I cried not from anger or shame, but from a strange mixture of grief and relief. Someone had seen me. Not my title or my past or my failure. Just me, doing my job, worthy of respect. That moment became a turning point. I started paying attention to the small kindnesses that surrounded me. Miguel, one of my fellow drivers, always saved me the better delivery orders when he could. Sarah, the young woman who worked the register, would slip me free garlic knots when the manager was not looking. Even Derek, awkward as he was, genuinely cared about his employees and worked hard to make sure we were treated fairly. I also began noticing the customers who treated me with respect and dignity. The elderly man who always asked about my day and told me stories about his youth in Brooklyn. The young family who invited me to warm up in their lobby on freezing nights. The nurse who worked night shifts and always left detailed delivery instructions to make my job easier. These interactions reminded me that goodness existed in ordinary moments, in simple human connections that had nothing to do with status or success. 3 months into the job, I had developed a routine that made the work bearable. I knew the fastest routes, the best parking spots, and which customers to expect trouble from. My coworkers had warmed up to me, though they still seemed puzzled by my presence. Derek, the young manager, occasionally asked if I was doing okay, his concern evident even as he struggled to understand how I had ended up here. I told no one about my previous life. The shame was too heavy, the fall too far. I had been somebody once, a person whose opinions mattered, whose decisions affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars. Now I was invisible, just another middle-aged woman in a pizza delivery uniform, hustling for tips that barely covered my gas expenses. But something was changing inside me. The work, humbling as it was, had stripped away the pretense and ego that had defined my corporate existence. I was learning lessons that no business school had ever taught me. About resilience, about humility, about the difference between status and worth, about the invisible workers who kept cities running, whose labor made comfortable lives possible for people like the executive I used to be. I started to understand that my corporate success had been built on a foundation of privilege I had never fully acknowledged. The assistant who managed my calendar, the cleaning staff who worked after hours, the delivery people who brought lunch to endless meetings. I had barely seen them as individuals. They had been functions, services, background elements to my important work. Now I was one of them, and I discovered they had names, families, dreams, struggles. They were funny, kind, frustrated, hopeful. They were fully human, and I had been blind to it for decades. The shame I felt was no longer just about my fall from grace. It was about the person I had been, the casual indifference I had shown to people whose work made mine possible. One Thursday evening in late October, I received a delivery order for an address in Brooklyn Heights, one of the wealthier neighborhoods on my route. The order was substantial: 8 large pizzas, garlic knots, and several 2-liter bottles of soda. It suggested either a party or a family gathering. The tip had been prepaid online, a standard 20% that would be split among the drivers. I loaded the order carefully into my aging sedan and headed out into the cold autumn evening. The address led me to a beautiful brownstone on a tree-lined street, the kind of home I had once dreamed of owning before my career imploded. Lights glowed warm in the windows, and I could hear laughter and music from inside. I grabbed the pizza bags and climbed the front steps, pressing the doorbell with my elbow. A woman in her early 30s answered, her face flushed with happiness. She called over her shoulder for someone to help with the food. As I handed over the pizzas, a man appeared behind her. He was in his late 50s with silver hair and an air of quiet confidence. He wore casual but expensive clothes, a cashmere sweater and well-fitted jeans. The woman, whose name I learned was Amanda, thanked me and turned to carry the pizzas inside. The man lingered in the doorway, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. There was recognition in his eyes, though I was certain we had never met. He spoke my name. Jennifer Hayes, right? From Henderson Financial? My heart stopped. I wanted to deny it, to pretend he was mistaken, but my face must have given me away. I nodded slowly, waiting for the pity or judgment I had grown to expect. Instead, he smiled warmly and extended his hand. His name was Robert Thornton. He introduced himself as an investor and entrepreneur who had been watching the financial services industry for years. He said he had heard me speak at a conference 5 years earlier about sustainable growth strategies and risk management. He said my presentation had influenced his approach to several major investments. I stood on that doorstep, cold wind cutting through my thin jacket, holding empty insulated bags, and tried to reconcile his words with my current reality. He invited me inside, but I declined, conscious of my appearance and the 3 other deliveries waiting in my car. He asked if we could talk sometime, gave me his business card, and promised to be in touch. I drove away confused and unsettled. The business card sat on my passenger seat like an accusation. Robert Thornton was the founder and chief executive officer of Thornton Ventures, a private equity firm I had read about in financial publications. He was worth hundreds of millions, possibly billions, and he remembered me. I told myself it meant nothing. Wealthy people were often polite to service workers as a form of casual charity. I had probably imagined the genuine respect in his voice. I threw the business card in my glove compartment and tried to forget the encounter. But I could not forget. Over the following days, the conversation replayed in my mind during long delivery shifts. I thought about the person I had been at that conference, confident and articulate, sharing insights I had earned through years of experience. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. 2 weeks later, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost did not answer, assuming it was another debt collector or spam call, but something made me pick up. It was Robert Thornton. He apologized for the delay in calling and asked if I would be willing to meet him for coffee. He said he had a proposition that might interest me. His tone was professional and respectful, with none of the condescension I had learned to expect. I agreed to meet, though I had no idea what he could possibly want. We scheduled a time at a coffee shop in Manhattan, neutral territory where I would not feel trapped or obligated. I spent the evening before the meeting agonizing over what to wear. I no longer owned the expensive suits that had once filled my closet, sold off months ago to pay bills. I settled on the best of what remained, a conservative dress and blazer that had seen better days. The coffee shop was busy with the morning rush when I arrived. Robert was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. He stood when he saw me, greeting me with the same warm smile from the doorstep. We sat down, and the awkwardness I expected never materialized. He asked about my current situation with genuine curiosity rather than pity, and I found myself telling him more than I intended. I explained about the firing, the confrontation, the months of unemployment, and the desperate need that had led me to delivering pizza. I expected judgment or discomfort, but Robert listened intently, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he told me his own story. 25 years earlier, he had been fired from a major investment bank for refusing to participate in practices he considered unethical. He had been blackballed by the industry, unable to find work anywhere in Manhattan. He spent 2 years working odd jobs, including a stint as a taxi driver, while he figured out his next move. Those years, he said, had taught him more about resilience and human nature than his entire previous career. Eventually, he started his own firm with savings and a small loan from his father. The first 5 years were brutal, filled with failures and near bankruptcy. But he persisted, guided by the lessons he learned during his lowest point. Now his firm managed over $2 billion in assets and was known for ethical investing and sustainable growth strategies. He said he saw something in me that reminded him of his younger self: intelligence, experience, and a willingness to speak truth to power, even when it cost me everything. He said those qualities were rare and valuable, especially in someone who had been humbled by failure. Then he made his proposition. He was launching a new division of his firm focused on restructuring struggling companies. He needed someone with deep operational experience, someone who understood both corporate finance and the human cost of bad decisions. Someone who had lived through failure and come out the other side. He offered me a position as director of operations with a salary that made my head spin. I sat there stunned, unable to process what I was hearing. It felt like a dream, the kind of fantasy I had indulged in during the darkest moments of the past year. I asked him why he would take a chance on someone whose reputation had been destroyed, whose last act in corporate America had been a public meltdown. Robert leaned forward, his expression serious. Because that confrontation told me you still cared. You were angry because you believed the company was making mistakes. Most people in your position would have taken the severance and left quietly. You fought because you thought it mattered. That passion, combined with your experience, is exactly what I need. I wanted to accept immediately, but years of disappointment had made me cautious. I asked for time to think about it, to review the offer in detail. Robert agreed without hesitation, giving me a folder with the job description, salary information, and benefits package. He said to take as long as I needed and to call him with any questions. I left that coffee shop feeling like I was floating. The folder felt heavy in my bag, weighted with possibility. But as I rode the subway back to Brooklyn, doubt crept in. What if this was too good to be true? What if I failed again? What if I had lost the skills and confidence that once made me good at this work? That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed the offer in detail. The salary was more than I had made at Henderson, with equity options and bonuses tied to performance. The job description was challenging but aligned perfectly with my experience. The benefits were generous, including health insurance I desperately needed. There was even relocation assistance if I needed to move closer to the Manhattan office. I thought about calling my sister Rachel, about sharing this incredible turn of events, but something held me back. I had not told her about delivering pizza, about how far I had fallen. The gap between my worst moment and this opportunity was too wide to explain over the phone. Instead, I did something I had not done in months. I looked at myself honestly in the mirror. The woman looking back was tired, older than her years, marked by struggle and disappointment. But there was something new in her eyes, too. A hardness earned through survival, a resilience forged in the fire of total failure. I realized something important in that moment. The corporate executive I had been at Henderson was successful but brittle. One setback had shattered her completely. The woman I was now, the one who had delivered pizza in the rain and smiled through humiliation, was stronger. She had survived the fall and landed on her feet. She had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. I called Robert the next morning and accepted the position. The transition back to corporate life was strange and disorienting. I gave my notice at Tony's Pizza Palace, and Derek seemed genuinely happy for me, though clearly curious about where I was going. My coworkers threw me an impromptu party on my last shift, presenting me with a card everyone had signed and a gift certificate to a nice restaurant. Their kindness brought tears to my eyes. Starting at Thornton Ventures felt like entering a parallel universe. I had an office again, though I insisted on something modest rather than the executive suite Robert initially offered. I met the team I would be working with, a mix of young analysts and experienced professionals. They treated me with respect, unaware of my recent history. Robert had introduced me simply as a veteran executive with extensive operational experience. The work was challenging in the best way. Our division focused on companies in crisis, businesses that had lost their way due to poor management, market changes, or internal dysfunction. My job was to analyze their operations, identify problems, and develop restructuring plans that could save jobs while returning the company to profitability. It was humbling work that required both analytical skill and deep empathy. I thought constantly about my own failure, about the employees at Henderson who had depended on leaders like me to make good decisions. I was determined never to recommend a course of action that prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability and human welfare. My first major project was a mid-sized manufacturing company in New Jersey that was on the verge of bankruptcy. The executive team blamed market conditions and foreign competition, but as I dug into their operations, I found the real problems. Poor inventory management, outdated equipment, and a toxic workplace culture that had driven away their most skilled workers. I spent 3 months on site, working with employees at every level to understand the real issues. I talked to floor workers, supervisors, and middle managers who had been ignored by senior leadership. I discovered innovations and efficiencies that had been proposed years earlier, but never implemented. Most importantly, I found people who cared deeply about their work and wanted the company to succeed. The first week at the manufacturing plant was eye-opening. I arrived in business casual attire, notebook in hand, ready to observe operations. The plant manager, a gruff man named Bill Thompson who had been with the company for 32 years, looked me up and down with obvious skepticism. "Another consultant," his expression said. "Another overpaid person from Manhattan who thinks they know our business better than we do." I could not blame him. I would have felt the same way in his position. So instead of launching into an analysis or asking for reports, I asked if I could shadow him for the day. I wanted to see the work as he saw it, to understand the challenges from his perspective. Bill seemed surprised but agreed. We spent the entire day walking the factory floor, and he introduced me to workers, explained processes, and pointed out inefficiencies that headquarters had ignored for years. He showed me equipment that desperately needed replacement, safety issues that had been reported multiple times without response, and workflow bottlenecks that could be fixed with minimal investment. More importantly, I met the people who made this company run. Maria, a machine operator who had been there for 18 years and had ideas for improving production speed that no one had ever asked about. James, a young engineer fresh out of college who saw the potential for automation in certain processes, but had been told the company could not afford to innovate. Linda, the shift supervisor who had kept morale from completely collapsing despite the uncertainty and fear that pervaded the workplace. I listened to them. Really listened. The way no one had listened to me when I tried to warn Henderson about unsustainable practices. I took notes, asked questions, and treated their expertise with the respect it deserved. By the end of that first week, Bill's skepticism had softened. He told me I was the first consultant who had bothered to learn about the actual work before proposing solutions. Over the following weeks, I discovered the deeper problems. The CEO was a second-generation owner who had inherited the business but lacked the skills or interest to run it effectively. He made decisions based on pride rather than data, refusing to admit that his judgment might be flawed. The executive team was divided into factions, more concerned with internal politics than company survival. Communication between management and workers was virtually non-existent. The financial situation was worse than the initial report suggested. Cash flow was critical, debt service was consuming most available capital, and several major customers had quietly started sourcing from competitors. Without significant changes, the company had maybe 6 months before bankruptcy became inevitable. I spent my evenings in a cheap hotel near the plant, analyzing data and developing proposals. I thought constantly about my own failure at Henderson, about the warning signs I had seen and the resistance I had encountered when I tried to address them. I was determined not to let this company make the same mistakes. The restructuring plan I developed was comprehensive and painful. It required the CEO to step back from daily operations, bringing in experienced management to run the company while he retained ownership. It required significant changes to the executive team, including removing or reassigning several longtime employees who were more hindrance than help. It required substantial investment in new equipment, financed through a combination of debt restructuring and new capital investment from Thornton Ventures. Most controversially, it required eliminating 37 positions out of a workforce of 212. These cuts were strategic, targeting administrative redundancies and consolidating overlapping functions. It was far fewer jobs than would be lost in bankruptcy, but it was still 37 families facing uncertainty and hardship. I insisted on delivering the news personally to each affected employee. Robert questioned whether this was necessary, whether it was the best use of my time. But I remembered the coldness of my own firing, the security guard standing in my office while I packed boxes, the complete absence of humanity in how it was handled. I would not do that to these people. I spent 2 horrible days in individual meetings, explaining the situation honestly and helping each person understand their options. Some were angry, some cried, some accepted it with quiet resignation. I provided detailed severance packages, job placement assistance, and extended health insurance. It did not make the loss easier, but it showed respect for their service and humanity. One meeting particularly gutted me. A man named Frank had worked in shipping for 15 years. He was 54, 2 years older than I had been when fired. He had a daughter in college and a son in high school. As I explained that his position was being eliminated, I saw my own fear and shame reflected in his eyes. He asked me the same question I had asked David Chen. Why? What did I do wrong? I told him the truth. He had done nothing wrong. The company had made bad decisions for years, and now everyone had to pay the price. His work had been good, but the company could no longer afford his position. It was unfair, it was painful, and I was sorry. Frank looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked how I could do this, how I could sit there and destroy someone's livelihood and act like I cared. I could have given him the corporate answer about necessary changes and long-term sustainability. Instead, I told him about Henderson, about being fired at 52, about delivering pizza, about knowing exactly how terrifying it was to face an uncertain future. I told him I was not asking him to accept anything I had not lived through myself. Frank's anger softened into something more complex. He asked if I had survived it, if things had gotten better. I told him yes, eventually, though the path had been harder than I ever imagined. He nodded slowly, then stood and shook my hand. He said he appreciated my honesty, that it was more than most people in my position would have given him. That conversation stayed with me for years. It reinforced my belief that business decisions, even necessary ones, should never lose sight of the human beings affected by them. Numbers on spreadsheets represented real lives, real families, real consequences. The restructuring plan I presented to Robert and the company's board was different from anything they had seen before. Yes, it included the typical financial projections and operational improvements, but it also included a detailed section on minimizing human harm, on treating workers with dignity throughout the transition, on investing in the community that depended on this company for employment. Some board members were skeptical. They questioned whether the human considerations were relevant to a business turnaround. One particularly aggressive investor argued that my approach was too soft, that more dramatic cuts would generate better returns faster. I stood my ground. I explained that sustainable turnarounds required buy-in from the workforce, that treating people decently was not just morally right but strategically smart. I pointed out that the companies with the best long-term performance were those that valued their employees and communities. I made the case not just with data but with conviction born from lived experience. Robert supported me. He told the board that this human-centered approach was exactly why he had hired me, why Thornton Ventures would be different from other private equity firms. The board approved the plan, though not everyone was happy about it. The plan was approved, and over the following year, I watched the company transform. Production improved, employee morale increased, and the financial numbers moved steadily into the black. It was not quick or easy, but it worked. The company survived, hundreds of jobs were saved, and I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced in my previous career. Robert noticed. He began giving me larger, more complex projects. A retail chain struggling with the shift to online sales. A family-owned business torn apart by succession conflicts. A technology startup that had grown too fast and lost control of its operations. Each project taught me something new and reinforced lessons I had learned the hard way. I also started to rebuild my professional reputation. I spoke at industry conferences again, not as the corporate executive promoting growth at any cost, but as someone who understood failure and recovery. I wrote articles about sustainable business practices and the human cost of short-term thinking. People listened, not because I was successful, but because I had been broken and rebuilt. My relationship with my sister Rachel improved unexpectedly. 6 months into my new job, I finally told her everything. The firing, the confrontation, the months delivering pizza, and the miraculous second chance. I expected pity or judgment, but Rachel surprised me. She said she had always admired my ambition, but worried that I was sacrificing too much for career success. She said the sister she was getting to know now seemed happier, more grounded, more human than the driven executive she had known before. We started having regular dinners, and I met her children properly for the first time in years. I discovered I actually enjoyed being an aunt when I was present enough to notice. The conversation with Rachel happened on a rainy Saturday afternoon at her home in Connecticut. I had avoided visiting for months, unable to face the questions I knew would come. But she had been persistent, calling weekly, sensing something was wrong even though I had not told her anything specific. When I finally showed up at her door, she took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. We sat in her kitchen, drinking tea while her kids played in the basement, and I told her everything. The words poured out in a rush, months of isolation and shame finally finding release. I cried as I talked about the firing, about the security guard, about Christine's betrayal. I cried as I described delivering pizza, about the humiliation and fear and desperate scramble to survive. Rachel listened without interruption, her artist's hands wrapped around her mug, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finally finished, exhausted and emotionally raw, I waited for her response with dread. I expected her to be shocked, disappointed, perhaps even satisfied that her stable life choices had proven wiser than my ambitious gamble. Instead, she asked me a question I had not anticipated. She asked if I was okay now. Not financially, not professionally, but actually okay. As a person, as her sister, as Jennifer. The question broke something open inside me. I realized that no one had asked me that in months. Everyone at Thornton Ventures asked about projects and strategies. Derek at the pizza place had asked if I could handle the work. Robert had asked about my plans and capabilities. But no one had asked if I, the person beneath the titles and circumstances, was okay. I told Rachel I did not know. I was surviving. I was working hard. I was grateful for the opportunity Robert had given me. But I felt fundamentally changed in ways I was still trying to understand. The woman I had been for 52 years no longer existed, and I was not sure who had taken her place. Rachel nodded slowly. Then she said something that shifted my entire perspective. She said that maybe the woman I had been needed to stop existing. That maybe Jennifer, the senior vice president, had been a costume I wore for so long I forgot it was not really me. That maybe losing everything was not a tragedy but a liberation. Her words hit me like cold water. I started to protest, to defend the career I had built and the person I had been. But Rachel stopped me gently. She reminded me of things I had forgotten or chosen not to see. How I had missed her wedding rehearsal for a late meeting. How I had sent expensive gifts to her kids instead of visiting. How I had always been too busy, too important, too caught up in work to really be part of the family. She said those choices were mine to make, and she had never judged me for them. But she also said I had seemed lonely for years, stressed and exhausted, and never truly happy despite all the success. She said she had worried about me, wondered what would happen when the career that consumed my life inevitably ended. Now it had ended, earlier and more dramatically than anyone expected, and Rachel said I had a chance to decide who I wanted to be without the corporate identity that had defined me. She said I could mourn the old Jennifer while building something more authentic. Her children came upstairs then, interrupting our conversation. Emily was 12, bright and creative like her mother. Noah was 9, full of energy and questions. Ben was 6, shy and sweet. They knew me as Aunt Jennifer, who sent birthday cards and occasionally appeared at holidays, but we had no real relationship. Emily asked if I could stay for dinner. Before I could make an excuse about having work to do, Rachel gave me a look that said, "Stay." So I did. We made pasta together, the kids chattering about school and friends and the everyday dramas of childhood. Noah asked what I did for work, and before I could give a polished corporate answer, I found myself telling the truth. I told them I helped companies that were in trouble. I explained that sometimes businesses made mistakes and needed help fixing them before everyone lost their jobs. Emily asked smart questions about how that worked. Noah wanted to know if I was like a superhero who saved companies. Ben just wanted to show me his Lego creations. It was the most relaxed I had felt in months. There were no pretenses, no performance, no need to be impressive or important. Just family dinner with normal conversation and laughter and the comfortable chaos of children. When I left that evening, Emily hugged me goodbye and asked when I would visit again. I promised it would be soon, and I meant it. After that, visits to Rachel's became regular. Every other week, I would drive to Connecticut on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes we just talked, catching up on life without the careful distance that had characterized our adult relationship. Other times I helped with her kids, taking them to activities or helping with homework, discovering the pleasure of being genuinely present in their lives. Rachel and I also started talking about our childhood, about the different paths we had chosen and why. She told me she had always felt compared to me, measured against my academic and professional achievements. I told her I had envied her creativity and freedom, her ability to choose passion over prestige. We laughed about how we had both been looking at each other's lives with longing, while feeling inadequate in our own. One evening, about a year into my work at Thornton Ventures, Rachel asked if I had thought about dating. I admitted I had not, that I felt too damaged, too uncertain of who I was to invite someone else into my life. Rachel challenged that gently. She said I had been using work as an excuse to avoid intimacy for years, and now I was using my recovery as a different excuse for the same avoidance. Her observation stung because it was accurate. I had always been too busy for serious relationships, too focused on career advancement to prioritize personal connections. The few relationships I had were casual and convenient, easily sacrificed when work demanded my attention. I had told myself I was independent and self-sufficient, but Rachel suggested I might just be afraid of being truly known by another person. She told me about a friend of hers, Thomas, who taught history at the high school where she worked. He was recently divorced, thoughtful and kind, and nothing like the ambitious corporate types I had dated before. Rachel thought we might like each other, if I was willing to try. I was skeptical, even resistant. The idea of dating felt overwhelming, like adding complexity to a life I was still trying to stabilize. But Rachel persisted with gentle encouragement, and eventually I agreed to join them for a casual dinner where Thomas would happen to be present. I met Thomas on a chilly October evening at a small restaurant in Connecticut. He was tall and slightly rumpled, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had none of the polished confidence I associated with successful men. Instead, he had an authenticity that immediately put me at ease. We talked about teaching and business, about books and history and the challenges of helping people learn and grow. Thomas told stories about his students with genuine affection, describing their struggles and breakthroughs with the care of someone who truly believed his work mattered. He asked about my job with real curiosity, listening intently as I explained corporate restructuring without any pretense of already knowing everything. What struck me most was how comfortable I felt. There was no performance, no need to be impressive or hide the messy parts of my story. When he asked how I had gotten into restructuring work, I found myself telling him about Henderson, about the firing and the pizza delivery and the second chance. I watched his face as I spoke, waiting for judgment or pity. Instead, Thomas nodded thoughtfully and said it sounded like I had learned more in a year than most people learn in a decade. He said failure was the best teacher, that his divorce had taught him things about himself that success never could. He said growth required breaking, and breaking required courage to face honestly. We started seeing each other regularly after that. Nothing dramatic or rushed, just dinners and walks and long conversations. Thomas introduced me to his world, to local theater productions and historical sites and community events I had never noticed during my corporate years. He showed me that richness existed in ordinary moments, in connections with people and places that had nothing to do with status or achievement. One afternoon, about 18 months into my job at Thornton Ventures, Robert asked me to join him for lunch. We went to a quiet restaurant near the office, and I could tell he had something important to discuss. After we ordered, he got straight to the point. The restructuring division had exceeded all expectations. We had saved 14 companies from bankruptcy, preserved over 3,000 jobs, and generated substantial returns for our investors. More importantly, we had developed a reputation for ethical, effective corporate transformation. Other firms were trying to copy our model. Robert wanted to expand significantly, hiring more staff and taking on bigger projects. And he wanted me to lead the expansion as Senior Vice President of the Restructuring Division. It was a promotion that came with substantial additional compensation, a leadership team I would build, and autonomy to shape the division's future direction. I accepted without hesitation this time. The fear and doubt that had paralyzed me after Henderson were gone, replaced by confidence earned through actual accomplishment. I knew I could do this work, not because I had never failed, but because I had failed completely and survived. Building the team was the most rewarding part of the new role. I looked for people with unconventional backgrounds, those who had experienced setbacks and learned from them. I hired a former executive who had lost everything in the financial crisis, a young analyst who had dropped out of a prestigious MBA program due to family obligations, and a restructuring specialist who had declared personal bankruptcy years earlier. I wanted people who understood that business success was built on human foundations. The hiring process itself became a reflection of the lessons I had learned. Instead of the traditional corporate interviews focused on credentials and polished presentations, I looked for authenticity, resilience, and genuine empathy. I wanted people who had been broken and rebuilt themselves, who understood that numbers on spreadsheets represented real human lives. The first unconventional hire was Marcus Chen, no relation to David from Henderson despite sharing a surname. Marcus had been a rising star at a major consulting firm until the financial crisis decimated his personal investments and forced him into bankruptcy at age 38. He had spent 3 years rebuilding his credit and reputation, working his way back up through smaller firms. Other companies saw his bankruptcy as disqualifying. I saw it as evidence that he understood real consequences and would never be cavalier about financial decisions again. During his interview, Marcus was refreshingly honest about his failure. He explained the risky investments he had made based on overconfidence and incomplete information. He talked about the shame of bankruptcy, the damage to his marriage that ultimately ended in divorce, the years of rebuilding both his finances and his sense of self. He did not try to minimize his mistakes or blame external factors. He owned what he had done and explained what he had learned. I hired him on the spot. Marcus became one of my most trusted analysts, bringing both technical expertise and hard-won wisdom about risk and consequences. He had a gift for seeing beyond the numbers to the human systems that created them. When we evaluated struggling companies, he always asked about the people making decisions, about the incentives and pressures they faced, about how the organizational culture might be contributing to poor outcomes. The second key hire was Keisha Washington, a 31-year-old analyst who had dropped out of a prestigious MBA program at Harvard Business School. She had been on track to graduate with honors when her younger brother was diagnosed with leukemia. Their mother had died years earlier. Their father was absent, and Keisha was her brother's only family. She had withdrawn from school to care for him through 2 years of treatment. Her brother had survived, thanks in part to Keisha's fierce advocacy and constant presence. But her incomplete MBA had stalled her career trajectory. She had been working at a regional bank for 3 years, clearly overqualified for her position, but unable to break through the barriers created by her unconventional resume. When I interviewed her, she was defensive at first, ready for the judgment she had learned to expect. I asked her about her brother instead, about what she learned caring for someone through a life-threatening illness, about navigating hospital bureaucracies and insurance companies, about making impossible decisions with limited information. Keisha's entire demeanor changed. She talked about advocating for her brother when he was too sick to speak for himself, about learning medical terminology and treatment options, about fighting for every possible chance at survival. Then I asked how those experiences applied to business. Keisha looked surprised by the question, as though no one had ever made that connection before. She thought for a moment, then explained that crisis management was crisis management whether in hospitals or corporations, that understanding systems and incentives was crucial to navigating them effectively, that empathy and analytical thinking were not opposites but complementary skills, that the stakes in business were lower than life and death, which gave her perspective that made her better at assessing real risks versus imagined ones. I hired her immediately. Keisha brought an unusual combination of empathy and analytical rigor to our work. She was fearless in challenging conventional wisdom, having already faced down much scarier opponents than corporate executives. She also had zero tolerance for unnecessary cruelty in business decisions. If someone proposed layoffs that seemed motivated by convenience rather than necessity, Keisha would push back hard with better alternatives. The third unconventional hire was David Nguyen, a 56-year-old restructuring specialist who had declared personal bankruptcy 4 years earlier. David had been a successful consultant for 2 decades before his gambling addiction destroyed his finances and nearly destroyed his family. He had gone through treatment, rebuilt his relationship with his wife and adult children, and was now working his way back into the industry. Most firms would not touch him. Addiction carried stigma, and personal bankruptcy suggested poor judgment. But when I interviewed David, I saw something different. I saw someone who had faced his demons honestly, done the hard work of recovery, and emerged with clarity about what truly mattered. He was humble in a way that successful people rarely are, grateful for second chances in a way that transformed how he approached his work. David brought not only technical expertise, but also emotional intelligence that was rare in corporate consulting. He could read people, understand the unspoken dynamics in organizations, identify the fear and pride and desperation that drove bad decisions. He was also incredibly honest with clients, willing to deliver hard truths that others might sugarcoat. His recovery had given him courage born from having already lost everything and survived. Together with Christine, who had proven herself through dedicated work and genuine transformation, this became the core of my team. We were an unconventional group, marked by failures and comebacks, bound by shared understanding that business was fundamentally about people. We brought empathy and analytical rigor, personal experience and professional expertise, humility and determination. The team dynamic was unlike anything I had experienced in corporate America. We were honest with each other in ways that traditional business culture rarely allows. When someone made a mistake, we discussed it openly and learned from it, rather than hiding or blaming. When someone was struggling personally, we supported them rather than expecting them to pretend everything was fine. We challenged each other's thinking without defending our egos, focused on finding the best solutions rather than being right. We also celebrated successes differently. When a company we restructured started thriving again, we did not just track the financial returns. We talked about the workers who kept their jobs, the communities that maintained economic stability, the families who avoided the catastrophic disruption of unemployment. We measured success not just in dollars, but in lives preserved and improved. Under my leadership, the division grew rapidly. We developed innovative approaches to corporate restructuring that balanced financial necessity with social responsibility. We became known for saving companies that other investors considered lost causes. Business schools started studying our methods. Industry publications profiled our work. But the real validation came from unexpected sources. Employees from companies we had restructured sent thank you notes, saying we had saved their livelihoods and treated them with dignity during difficult transitions. Community leaders in towns where we worked praised our commitment to preserving local jobs. These letters, more than any financial success, told me I was doing something meaningful. One letter in particular moved me deeply. It came from Frank, the 54-year-old shipping worker I had laid off from that first manufacturing company in New Jersey. He wrote to tell me that losing his job had been the hardest thing he had ever faced. The severance and job placement assistance I provided had helped, but the first year was brutal. He had to sell his house, move his family to a smaller apartment, watch his kids adjust their dreams to match reduced circumstances. But he had survived. He found a new job with slightly lower pay but better benefits. His daughter graduated from college with the help of student loans he could manage. His son was thriving in high school. And Frank wrote that he understood now why the layoffs had been necessary, that if the company had gone bankrupt, everyone would have lost everything. He thanked me for being honest with him, for treating him with respect even while delivering devastating news. He said it had made a difference in how he processed the loss and moved forward. I cried when I read that letter. It validated the approach I had fought for, The belief that doing right by people was not just morally correct, but strategically sound. Frank's resilience reminded me of my own journey, of the strength we discover when survival demands it. His gratitude reminded me that our work had real impact on real lives, that the decisions we made in conference rooms rippled out into families and communities in profound ways. 2 years into leading the division, I received a phone call that brought my journey full circle. It was Christine Park, my former colleague from Henderson Financial Group. She had gotten my contact information from someone in the industry and asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, though I felt anxious about seeing her again. Our last interaction had been my angry confrontation in the Henderson lobby, a moment I still cringe to remember. We met at the same coffee shop where Robert had offered me the second chance that changed everything. Christine looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. She ordered coffee with shaking hands and then apologized. She said she had been a coward when I was fired, had prioritized her own position over loyalty and friendship. She said watching me get escorted out had haunted her ever since. Then she told me what had happened after I left. David Chen's aggressive expansion plans had failed spectacularly. The company had overextended itself, made risky investments that collapsed, and lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The board had fired David, but the damage was done. Henderson Financial Group was now struggling, laying off employees and selling assets to stay afloat. Christine was still there, but only barely. She was exhausted, demoralized, and looking for a way out. She had heard about my work at Thornton Ventures and asked, almost desperately, if there might be any opportunities there. I looked at her across the table, this woman who had hurt me so deeply, who had stood silently while I was destroyed. 2 years earlier, I would have felt vindicated, even triumphant. But the person I was now felt only sadness for the waste and damage caused by fear and politics. I told her I would think about it. I said I needed to process what she had told me and consider whether we could work together again. She nodded, understanding that forgiveness, if it came, would not be immediate or easy. We parted with a tentative promise to talk again soon. That evening, I sat in my apartment, which I had kept despite now being able to afford something much nicer. I had grown attached to the modest space that had witnessed my darkest days. I thought about Christine's request and what it meant. I realized that holding on to anger and resentment was pointless. Christine had made bad choices, but so had I. My public confrontation had been unprofessional and counterproductive, born of hurt pride rather than principle. We had both been caught in a toxic system that rewarded self-preservation over integrity. More importantly, I understood that forgiveness was not about excusing bad behavior. It was about refusing to let past wounds poison present opportunities. If Christine could contribute to the work we were doing, if she had genuinely learned from her mistakes, then giving her a chance was both compassionate and pragmatic. I called her the next week and offered her a position on my team, not in a leadership role, but as a senior analyst. I was clear that she would have to prove herself, that trust would be earned slowly. She accepted gratefully, and to her credit, she threw herself into the work with dedication that seemed to come from genuine repentance. Working with Christine was difficult at first. We were both careful, professional, maintaining distance while learning to trust again. But over time, something unexpected happened. We became genuine colleagues, united by shared experience and a commitment to doing work that mattered. Christine proved to be talented and hardworking, and her insider knowledge of how companies failed made her invaluable to our restructuring efforts. 3 years after starting at Thornton Ventures, I attended an industry conference where I was scheduled to give a keynote address about ethical corporate transformation. As I stood backstage waiting to go on, I thought about the journey that had brought me there. The firing, the confrontation, the pizza deliveries, and the second chance. All of it seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. My speech was well received. I talked openly about my failure at Henderson, about delivering pizza at 52, about the lessons learned in humility and resilience. I argued that corporate success built on human suffering was ultimately unsustainable. I challenged the audience to prioritize long-term value creation over short-term profits, to see employees as assets rather than expenses, to lead with courage and integrity even when it was costly. After the speech, dozens of people approached me with stories of their own failures and comebacks. Young executives struggling with ethical dilemmas, older workers facing obsolescence, business owners trying to do right by their communities while staying profitable. Each conversation reminded me that my story was not unique. The corporate world was full of people fighting to maintain their integrity while navigating impossible pressures. That evening, Robert took me to dinner to celebrate. Over an excellent meal, he told me something I had not known. When he had seen me on his doorstep delivering pizza, he had immediately recognized me, but said nothing at first because he wanted to respect my privacy. He had gone online and researched what happened at Henderson, found articles about my firing and the confrontation. He said what impressed him most was not my previous success, but what I did after total failure. Instead of giving up or becoming bitter, I had done whatever work was necessary to survive. That resilience, that refusal to be defeated, was what convinced him I was worth investing in. Robert then made another announcement. He was expanding the firm again and creating a new role, Chief Operating Officer for all of Thornton Ventures. He wanted me to take the position. It would mean overseeing not just the restructuring division, but all operational aspects of the firm. It was a level of responsibility and authority beyond anything I had achieved at Henderson. I accepted, though this time I added a condition. I wanted to create a formal mentorship program within the firm, specifically designed for people who had experienced career failures or setbacks. I wanted to institutionalize the second chance I had been given, to make it available to others who deserved another opportunity. Robert agreed immediately. Within 6 months, we launched the program, recruiting mentors from across the industry who had their own comeback stories. We partnered with organizations that helped displaced workers and created pathways for people to rebuild their careers. The program became one of the most celebrated aspects of Thornton Ventures culture. My relationship with my family deepened in unexpected ways. Rachel and I grew genuinely close, and I became actively involved in my nieces' and nephews' lives. They knew me as Aunt Jennifer who had made mistakes and rebuilt her life, not as some distant successful executive. Their questions about my journey were honest and challenging, forcing me to articulate lessons I was still learning. I also started dating again, something I had abandoned during my corporate climbing years. I met Thomas, a high school history teacher, through Rachel's social circle. He was patient, thoughtful, and completely unimpressed by corporate success. He liked me for who I was, not what I had achieved. Our relationship developed slowly, built on genuine connection rather than shared professional ambitions. 5 years after being fired from Henderson, I attended my nephew's high school graduation. Sitting in the auditorium watching young people receive their diplomas, I reflected on how much had changed. I was now Chief Operating Officer of a firm managing over $5 billion in assets. I led a team of over 200 people. I had rebuilt my reputation as someone who combined business acumen with ethical leadership. But more importantly, I had rebuilt myself. The brittle, ambitious executive who had been destroyed by one setback was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more compassionate, more whole. I had learned that success meant nothing if it required sacrificing your integrity. I had learned that failure was not the end, but often the beginning of something better. I had learned that the lowest moment of your life could become the foundation for your greatest growth. After the graduation ceremony, my nephew James asked me for advice about his future. He was heading to college in the fall, uncertain about his path, anxious about making the right choices. I thought carefully before answering. I told him that the straight path to success was a myth. Life would knock him down, probably multiple times. He would make mistakes, face failures, experience rejection and disappointment. What mattered was not avoiding these setbacks, but learning to get back up, to adapt, to become stronger in the broken places. I told him that the qualities that would serve him best were not the ones celebrated in business schools or corporate culture. Resilience, integrity, empathy, and the willingness to do whatever work was necessary with dignity. These were the foundations of a meaningful life. I also told him something I wished someone had told me at his age, that success achieved by sacrificing your humanity and values was not success at all, that the respect of people you love was worth more than any professional achievement. That being broken and rebuilt made you more capable of genuine connection and compassion. James listened with the serious intensity of someone on the edge of adulthood. He thanked me, then asked one more question. Was it worth it? The failure, the humiliation, the struggle? I thought about standing on Robert Thornton's doorstep in a pizza delivery uniform, about the moment when I thought my life was over. I thought about the journey from that doorstep to where I stood now. I thought about the person I had been and the person I had become. Yes, I told him. It was worth it, because that failure stripped away everything false and left only what was real. It forced me to rebuild from the foundation up, to choose consciously what kind of person I wanted to be, rather than accepting the default script society had written for me. The firing at 52 had felt like the end of my story. Instead, it was the beginning of the most meaningful chapter. The woman who delivered pizzas and survived humiliation was stronger than the executive who never faced real adversity. The second chance I received was not about returning to who I was, but becoming who I was meant to be. 6 months later, I received an unexpected email. It was from a former Henderson Financial Group employee I barely remembered. She had been a junior analyst who had watched my confrontation with Christine and my escort out of the building. At the time, she was 26 years old and terrified of losing her own position in the instability following my firing. She wrote to tell me that watching me survive and rebuild had given her courage to make changes in her own life. She had left Henderson 2 years later to pursue work at a nonprofit focused on financial literacy in underserved communities. She earned a fraction of her corporate salary, but felt she was doing something meaningful. She thanked me for showing her that professional failure was survivable and that there were paths to success beyond climbing the traditional corporate ladder. Her email made me cry. Not from sadness, but from the realization that our struggles and comebacks ripple outward in ways we cannot predict. My worst moment had somehow inspired someone else's best decision. The public humiliation I thought had destroyed me had actually planted seeds of courage in someone I did not even know was watching. I framed that email and kept it in my office as a reminder of why the journey mattered. Not just for my own growth, but for the example it set, the paths it opened for others who needed to know that failure was not final. Today, as I write this, I am 59 years old. I lead a company division that has saved 63 businesses from bankruptcy and preserved over 15,000 jobs. I mentor young professionals and career comeback stories. I have rebuilt relationships with family and friends I had neglected during my climb. I am in a healthy relationship with someone who loves me for who I am, not what I achieve. But none of that is really the point. The point is that I am whole in a way I never was during my first successful career. I know who I am because I have been broken and rebuilt myself. I know what matters because I have lost everything and rediscovered what was essential. I know the value of dignity and resilience because I have had to summon them from nothing. The person who delivers pizzas at 52 after being fired is the same person who becomes chief operating officer at 57. Both are me. The humiliation and the triumph are inseparable parts of the same journey. You cannot have the wisdom without the failure, the strength without the breaking, the compassion without the suffering. If I could go back and prevent the firing, avoid the confrontation, skip the pizza delivery and the months of desperation, would I? The question seems obvious, but the answer is not. That version of me would still be the brittle executive whose self-worth was tied to her title and salary. She would still be sacrificing relationships and values for corporate success. She would still be building her life on a foundation that could collapse with one bad decision or political shift. The woman I am now is built on different foundations. My worth comes from who I am, not what I do. My success is measured by the lives I can positively impact, not just the profits I can generate. My legacy will be the people I helped rebuild and the system I helped change, not the position I held or the wealth I accumulated. This is what I learned from being fired at 52 and delivering pizza, that our lowest moments contain the seeds of our greatest transformations. That dignity is not about your circumstances, but about how you respond to them. That second chances are real, but you have to be willing to do the work of becoming someone worthy of them. That failure is not the opposite of success, but often its most important teacher. To anyone reading this who is in their own lowest moment, who has lost everything they thought defined them, who feels invisible and discarded and certain their story is over, I want you to know something. Your story is not over. This is not the end, but a doorway to something you cannot yet imagine. The strength you are developing right now, doing whatever work is necessary to survive with dignity, is building the foundation for whatever comes next. Do not waste energy on bitterness or revenge. Focus instead on becoming the person who deserves the second chance when it arrives, because it will arrive, though probably not in the form you expect. And when it does, you will be ready. Not because you never failed, but because you learned to get back up. The woman who handed pizzas to Robert Thornton that October evening was preparing to become the woman who would lead his company's operations. She just did not know it yet. The humiliation and desperation she felt were actually clarifying experiences, burning away everything false and leaving only what was strong enough to survive the fire. 7 years have passed since that doorstep encounter. I sometimes drive past Tony's Pizza Palace, and the memories flood back. The aching feet, the difficult customers, the exhaustion and embarrassment, but also the kindness of coworkers, the satisfaction of simple work done well, the resilience I discovered I possessed. I keep my old pizza delivery uniform in my closet, though it no longer fits quite right. It reminds me of where I have been and how far I have come. More importantly, it reminds me that I am the same person in both circumstances. The circumstances changed, but my essential self remained. The executive and the delivery driver are both me, and both contain important truths about who I am. Last month, I was invited to speak at Henderson Financial Group's annual leadership conference. The company had changed significantly since my firing. David Chen was long gone, replaced by new leadership that was slowly rebuilding the firm's reputation and stability. The invitation came with an apology from the current chief executive officer for how my departure had been handled. I accepted, though I spent days preparing for what felt like returning to the scene of my greatest professional trauma. Standing in the same conference room where I had once presented quarterly results, looking out at faces that included some who had witnessed my departure, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. But mostly, I felt compassion. I told them my story. The firing, the confrontation, the pizza delivery, and the rebuild. I talked about the lessons learned and the strength discovered. I challenged them to think differently about failure, about resilience, about what really matters in building a sustainable business and a meaningful life. The response was overwhelming. People approached me afterward with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of setback and recovery. Several current employees thanked me for speaking truth to power years ago, even though it cost me everything at the time. They said the company had learned from its mistakes, that my concerns about unsustainable growth had been valid, that the culture had shifted toward the values I had advocated for. I left Henderson that day feeling a sense of completion. The wound that had been opened 7 years earlier was finally healed, not because I had been vindicated or proven right, but because I had transcended the need for vindication. The company's trajectory, David Chen's failures, none of it mattered to my story anymore. I had moved beyond defining myself by that institution or that failure. Tonight, as I finish writing this account, I am sitting in my apartment, the same one I kept through all the changes. Thomas is reading on the couch, and my niece Rachel, named her daughter after me, is asleep in the guest room, staying with us while she visits colleges in the city. The life I have built is modest in some ways, extraordinary in others. I think about that moment 7 years ago when I stood on Robert Thornton's doorstep, delivering pizza in the cold, certain my life was over. I think about the woman I was then, broken and ashamed and surviving day to day. I wish I could tell her what was coming, the second chance and the transformation and the life waiting on the other side of her despair. But maybe it is better that she did not know. Maybe the journey only works if you live it one difficult day at a time, building strength you do not realize you are developing, preparing for opportunities you cannot yet imagine. Maybe you have to believe your story is over before you can begin writing the next chapter. What I know now is that being fired at 52 and delivering pizza was not the worst thing that ever happened to me. It was the necessary breaking that allowed me to rebuild as someone stronger, wiser, and more aligned with my deepest values. The humiliation was the price of admission to a life more meaningful than anything I had achieved before. To the person reading this from their own lowest point, know that your breaking is not your ending. It is your beginning. The strength you are developing, the wisdom you are earning, the character you are forging in this fire, these are preparing you for something you cannot yet see. Keep going. Do the work, whatever it is, with dignity. Survive this moment. Your second chance is coming, and when it arrives, you will be ready. Because here is the truth they do not tell you about success. The straight path breaks you slowly from within, compromise by compromise, until you do not recognize the person in the mirror. But the broken path, the one through failure and humiliation and desperate survival, that path teaches you who you really are. That path forces you to choose what matters. That path builds unshakable foundations because you have already survived the worst and know you can endure. I would not trade my broken path for 100 straight ones. The woman I am today, whole and strong and clear about what matters, could only have been forged in that fire. The executive who delivered pizza became the leader who changed lives because she learned that titles mean nothing and dignity means everything. She learned that success without integrity is hollow and that failure with grace is its own kind of victory. This is my story. It is a story of failure and redemption, of breaking and rebuilding, of losing everything and discovering what was essential. It is a story about discovering that your worth is not determined by your job title or bank balance, but by your integrity and resilience and capacity for growth. Most importantly, it is a story about second chances, not as gifts bestowed by others, but as opportunities we create through our refusal to give up, our willingness to do whatever work is necessary, and our courage to become someone worthy of the chances we seek. The second chance is not the beginning of the story. It is the reward for the work you do in the dark, when no one is watching, when you have every reason to quit but choose to continue anyway. That is what I learned delivering pizza at 52. That is what I know at 59. And that is what I want you to know. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your journey, your story is not over. Keep going. Your second chance is being prepared even now in ways you cannot yet see. All you have to do is survive this moment and stay ready. The rest will come.